Hello guys, on my channel I have a few very popular videos. One of them is transforming Blade to API plus Vue.js. It has more than 130k views and I decided in this video to refresh it. This one was done more than 1 year ago with older versions of Vue.js and Laravel, and I want to show you a different example with Laravel 9 and Vue.js 3. So let's transform this simple dashboard list of products from Laravel controllers, from typical Laravel MVC, into API with Vue.js 3. And first question, why would you need to do that? Why would you transform Blade into Vue.js? The main reason could be, one of the reasons, is to load the page quickly and then transform parts of the data from the API a bit later. So for example, you load the page, which is empty, then you have loading spinner, and then the data of that list comes a bit later in half a second or so. Of course, you can go further and build a typical SPA single page application with only Vue.js at the core architecture and then API on the backend, but even transforming one page from Blade to API with Vue.js may be a better user experience. Now, how to do that? So the initial project is typical Laravel Breeze installed, but instead of login and register, I just created a dashboard with one route, so home controller dashboard without any auth, and in that controller we'll load all the products and view the dashboard with the products. And that dashboard blade just contains the products with for each. So let's transform this part to load dynamically with Vue.js from the API. First, we need to build that API. So we need to build the API route and controller to get all the products. To do that, we generate that controller, PHP artisan make controller, and let's call it product controller, but with API as a subfolder. It's a common good practice to separate the controllers into subfolders and namespaces, which will be created automatically, by the way, as well as the folder. So product controller. And if we open that product controller, as you can see, the namespace is automatic, and let's create one method, index, public function index, and we will just return product all as it is. And then in the routes API file, we need to create that route. So route get products, we will assign it to product controller, class, and method index. Let's close the sidebar so you would see that. And by default, routes from routes API PHP file are loaded with the prefix /API. So if we go back to our page and load API products, the result is working. We have the data. Of course, it's not pretty to read. It's a JSON structure. So for reading the API calls, I advise to use some kind of API client. Probably the most popular is called Postman. Here I am in Postman and I launch the same API call, send, and the result is much more readable. So we have ID, name, description, and price for every product. This is exactly the structure of the database. So you can see that API is working. But there are a few problems with that result. It loads all the data from the database, but in fact API doesn't need to return all the data. If we take a look at the page, let's go back. All we need for each product is name, price, and part of the description. And price should be transformed as well. So first, we don't need created at and updated at. The page doesn't care about that. And price should be transformed. Price in the database is saved in cents, not in dollars. So we need to divide that by 100 and format with 2 decimal places. You can read a lot of articles online why you should store money data in cents, in integers instead of floats. It's because of potential rounding mistakes, so to avoid that. And also we need to cut the description to 50 characters. So to do that, Laravel has such a thing called API Resources to transform the data from the database into actually what you want to return from your API method. So we need to create a resource class, PHP artisan make resource, product resource, like this. And then it is saved in app HTTP resources product resource. By default, it is to array with parent to array, meaning it would return exactly the same array. But we replace that with our own array. And what fields do we actually need to return? We need to return ID, and this will be the same as the original. Original is this, so this ID we return. Then name, we need this name. Description will be transformed. For example, substring this description to 050 characters and then ... at the end. And then created at and updated at, we don't return that at all. And for price, we return number format from what I remember, this price, 2 decimals, and then divide by 100. And now to use that product resource in the controller, we replace product all, or in fact add something to product all. Add the transformation layer, which is product resource collection method, and parameter of that collection is actually product all. So what will happen? The query to the database that returns product all, and then another layer, another filter of transformation with that product resource. And now if we launch that with our Postman, we send the same request, and this is what we get. ID, name, shortened description, and price in dollars and cents. And also you see one new thing called data. So if you use Eloquent API Resources, by default, all the data is wrapped in another layer of data. It's a good practice to potentially have more data coming back, like error messages, like for pagination, for example, there's data and then there's next page and previous page and stuff like that. So Laravel kind of offers you, suggests you to wrap it up in the data, and we will use it in the Vue.js a few minutes later. So we have our API ready. Now we need to create the Vue.js component that would load that API. By default in Laravel we don't have Vue.js installed, so in package.json you have dependencies for the front end. Some of those dependencies come from default Laravel, some of them come from Laravel Breeze that I've installed for the front end, including like Tailwind for example, but we need to install Vue.js manually. So what we do is npm install Vue, and then you need to provide the version. Currently, at the moment, at the time of shooting this video, Vue.js 3 is the official version, which you can specify by providing Vue next or Vue 3. Let's go with Vue next. And it will install Vue.js, and it's similar to Composer install for those of you who are not familiar with npm install. So with Laravel, Composer.json contains the packages. So if we open that up, Composer.json is the set of packages, and when you run Composer install, it requires all the packages and installs them into a vendor folder. Similar with package.json, it installs all the front-end packages into node modules folder. So same logic, but just different behavior to a different folder. So we installed Vue.js. Now we go into the main file of Laravel project related to Vue.js and JavaScript in general. It is resources.js app.js. By default, the fresh Laravel project contains only require bootstrap and nothing else. Those 3 lines that I've just deleted, they come from Laravel Breeze, which use Alpine.js, which we don't use in this video at all, so I can safely delete that. So here we need to initialize Vue.js and create a component. To create a component, we open our dashboard blade, and our goal is to transform this into Vue.js component. So we have a grid of products, and instead of that products grid, we will have Vue.js component, and let's call it products grid, something like that. Like this. So this will be our final result, and it looks like HTML tag, right? And we will create the Vue.js component, which we will assign to that HTML tag. So we just copy everything from for each here from blade file into our new component, which we will create in resources.js. Let's create a subfolder called components, and then we create products grid.vue file. It's a common practice to have camel case names if you have, for example, 2-word Vue.js components. So we create products grid, and every Vue.js component consists of 2 parts: template and script. Like this. So template contains the HTML code, so what is actually shown. So we paste that from the blade, and we will replace for each in a minute, because Vue.js doesn't know anything about blade syntax and for each. But basically, this is what we will have in our component visually, and script will contain the code to call the API, get the result, and assign the variable which we will use instead of products. But for now, let's just delete all that for each loop and put static text in here. For example, coming soon. So I will show you that the page is loaded actually from the Vue.js and not from the blade. Then in resources.js app.js, we need to initialize Vue. And for that, we do import so-called create app from Vue. So Vue.js is installed already. And from that Vue, remember we did npm install Vue. From Vue, we need to load the function. It is the function called create app. And then we actually use it, create app. In our simple case, create app will not have any parameters. We just assign that to app create app. And then with that app, we can add components, like for example, app component, products grid, the one that we have created in the HTML. Then we need to define component here. And we import that component, import, let's call it products grid, in camel case from the same folder, /components, PHP auto suggests it to me, products grid.vue, and .vue is optional. And now we can use it to products grid. A few things to fix here, by the way. The empty parameter should be empty object for the create app, and before app, to define that, we need to add const in JavaScript. And now we can load the component as product grid, and then we need to mount that Vue.js application to one of the HTML tags in our application in the blade. App mount to the app, it's called root container. And that root container means that anywhere in your global dashboard blade or layout blade, for example, based on Laravel Breeze, we have blade component for X-app layout, which leads us to app blade, and somewhere here in the main app blade, we should define ID app, which means that inside of that ID app, it will load all the Vue.js application, and inside of all of that Vue.js application, anywhere in the blades, inside of that div, there could be Vue.js components. Like in the dashboard, we will have this products grid initialized within that ID app. So this is what is meant by mount to app. And now it's time to compile it all, compile our Vue.js application and check if we have coming soon on our page instead of the grid. For those of you who haven't worked with Vue.js applications or any front-end applications, here's how it works. In the resources.js app.js, you provide JavaScript code, which loads the components and various settings, and then npm compiles that into public JavaScript files. So whenever you run npm run dev, or there are other options like npm run prod, npm run watch, and I will talk about them in a minute, it compiles everything in resources.js into public.js app.js. So you don't need to manually edit public.js app.js, you need just to load it in your main layout. In our case, for example, there will be app blade, which will load asset.js app.js. We will just change it from asset to mix because we're using Laravel Mix under the hood. Together with Laravel Breeze, it's another tool from Laravel ecosystem to mix the assets. It is called mixed for a reason. It's mixing everything from resources.js and make the public file. So we use mix here, and to do that, we need to open another file called webpack mix.js in the main folder of Laravel, which is partly generated by Laravel Breeze with CSS stuff, and we need to also add Vue here. So mix.js, post CSS, and before that, we need to add Vue. So it would compile Vue.js as well. And now we run npm run dev. npm run dev. Later in this video, we will also run npm run watch, and I will tell you the difference. And now we have built successful by Laravel Mix. As you can see, the final file js.app.js is 1.42 megabytes. It seems a lot, but for production, you can compile it to much smaller file. And let's see how our page looks like. Finally, we refresh it. So we have our dashboard. Let's refresh it. And we see coming soon text here from our Vue.js component. So this is the proof that it actually works. And actually, if I refresh the page, keep an eye on when this is loaded and when the text is loaded. I refresh, and as you can see, coming soon comes a bit later again, and this one loads immediately and this one a bit later. So that's the whole purpose, one of the purposes of transforming the page into Vue.js with API. So this is loaded instantly, and the internal part comes a bit later from the API. And let's work on exactly that, transforming coming soon into actual grid from the API. For that, we go back to our component of products grid. For now, we don't have any grid, and let's return the for each here, and let's transform it into Vue.js for each. For that, we will transform that div into for loop. Div v4, this is the syntax. And we have product in products. We will have a property products of that component. We haven't created that yet. Then basically for each of products, and product will be the item name. Inside of all of that div, we have access to product.something. So instead of this product.name, we have Vue.js syntax of product.name. Instead of this number format here, we don't need to format that anymore because it will come from the API as correctly formatted already. So all we need to load is product.price. Same here for the description, we don't need any substrings anymore. It will come from the API, from the resources of Eloquent API Resource. Product description, ... will also come from the server. And we don't need that for each, and we don't need that and for each. So we have the template. Now in the script part, we define that products. How? You may find different syntax for Vue.js versions, and in Vue.js 3 you basically have two options: use older options API or newer composition API. In this video I will use older options API, so you would be able to use it even in Vue.js 2, or maybe you can still proceed with Vue.js 3 with the options API, and that's totally fine. But for more complex project, it totally makes sense to use composition API, and for that I have a separate video and a separate full course, and I will link that in the description below. But for now, let's go simple and do export default. This is the syntax of what we export to the template. We need to export the data that we can use here. So data would be a function, data, and we return the object of products, by default empty array. And as you can see, products here is not underlined anymore, so Vue.js component template recognizes products as variable. To fill the products, we need a method to get that from the API. That's why we define methods. For example, let's call the method getProducts without any parameters. And in here we use a library called Axios, which comes by default in Laravel. This is one of those package JSON things that come by default in Laravel without even Laravel Breeze. It is used to perform HTTP requests. So we need Axios request, Axios get to the URL of /API/products. Remember the one that we have created, the API. And when we get the result of that, we can use then. We have anonymous function with response as a parameter, and inside of that function we assign this products equals to response from the server, from the API, data.data. This sounds confusing, but response data is what actually comes from the server, and .data is because of Eloquent API Resource that we used in the Postman, this here. So it's the same name, but it actually means different things. If you don't have the data wrapper here from the API, then you don't need this layer. But in our case, we do need that, and we have this products. And finally, what we need to do here is to call getProducts as soon as our component is loaded. Or in other words, mounted. So our third parameter is mounted. On mounted, we do what? This getProducts. And now, as you can see, nothing is underlined. Everything is recognized by the same component in PHP Storm, so should be no errors. Now, if we refresh our page, nothing would change until we recompile the thing. You need to run npm run dev again, or to avoid that, you can run npm run watch, which will watch for any changes in resources.js app.js and will recompile it automatically. So now, let's run npm run watch, which will do the same thing as npm run dev, but additionally will watch for the changes. So build successful, and now if we refresh our page, instead of coming soon, we should have something different. Refresh, and we have our grid of data with the price, with everything that we needed. And to show you the npm run watch difference, let's change, for example, $, to euro, for example. I click save in PHP Storm, and as you can see, build successful already without me running npm run dev or recompiling. So it recompiled public.js app.js in the background, and now if I refresh the page, I have euros here. So that's it. We transformed our Blade component, Blade page, into Vue.js with API. Let's run through that again and summarize what we actually did. First, we created the Vue.js component, which loads the data from the API with Axios. Then we built that API in Laravel in Eloquent API Resources to return already transformed data, which we can use in the template part of the component. Here, name, price, and description, already transformed from the backend. Then we load that productsgrid.view in the app.js as a component of Vue.js application that we load with create app from Vue. We mount all of that to the ID app, which is in the main app blade, ID app here. To load all of that, we installed Vue.js, which is then in the package.json in the dependencies view here. It also installed Vue Loader under the hood, behind the scenes, although I didn't specify that specifically. And to recompile it all in the Webpack mix, we need to also compile Vue here. All of that will be in the repository on GitHub for free, so you can play around with that yourself, maybe make some changes and build some more stuff. So I hope this quick almost live coding lesson will be useful for beginners, so you would not be afraid of jumping to Vue.js or learning Vue.js. Of course, there's much more to learn, and I have a bit more complex example, but still for the beginner, so I would advise it as a next step here on my Laravel Daily Teachable.com, Vue.js plus Laravel 9 CRUD as a single page application, so you will become familiar with routing, with composition API that I've mentioned already in this video, and some more complex stuff in almost 3 hours. If you have any questions, shoot them below and subscribe to the channel to get videos on Laravel and Vue.js and other related topics in the future. See you guys in other videos.